November 1944. A prisoner of war camp in the American Midwest. Dawn breaks slowly over flat farmland. Frost clings to the grass beyond the barbed wire. Guard towers stand still, their silhouettes cutting into the pale sky. Inside the camp, German prisoners form a quiet line, boots crunching against frozen ground. Many are gone. Uniforms hang loose on shoulders that once carried rifles across Europe. They expect the same routine they have known for months of retreat and defeat. Thin rations, cold hunger, discipline without explanation. Then the doors of the field kitchen open. Steam rolls outward. The smell follows. Coffee, bread, meat simmering in large metal pots. Trays are passed down the line. Not scraps. Not emergency portions. Full plates. Hot breakfast. Later, there will be lunch. And then dinner. 3 meals. Each day, served without ceremony. German prisoners glance at one another, unsure how to react. Some eat quickly, afraid it will be taken away. Others slow down, confused by the absence of punishment. A few stare at the food before them, as if it does not belong here. Back home, German soldiers survive on rations that barely sustain life. Civilians starve. Cities burn. Yet here, in captivity, the enemy feeds them like officers. In that moment, a dangerous question takes shape inside the wire. What kind of enemy can afford this? And what does it say about a war already slipping out of reach? By the time German prisoners began arriving in large numbers at camps across the United States, the war in Europe had already turned against them. From late 1943 onward, the German army was retreating on every major front. In the east, entire formations were being destroyed or captured. In the west, Allied bombing and invasion were steadily dismantling Germany's ability to fight. Food was one of the first systems to collapse. German frontline rations had been shrinking since 1942. Supply trains were disrupted by air attacks. Fuel shortages slowed transport. Units on the Eastern Front often survived on whatever could be scavenged from devastated countryside. In Italy and France, retreating formations abandoned depots they could no longer protect. By 1944, many German soldiers were fighting on calories barely sufficient for survival. Civilians fared no better. Allied bombing crippled agriculture and food distribution. Ration cards provided less each month. Protein disappeared first, then fats, then bread. Quality itself. Malnutrition became widespread. Hunger was no longer temporary, it was structural. German soldiers carried this reality into captivity. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for the worst. They were warned that surrender meant starvation, forced labor, and humiliation. American camps were described as brutal holding pens where prisoners would be worked until they collapsed. These messages were reinforced by stories from the Eastern Front, where captivity often meant death. So when German POWs were transported across the Atlantic in 1943 and 1944, they expected the same fate. Instead, they encountered a system built on rules. The United States had committed itself to the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, which mandated humane treatment, adequate shelter, medical care, and nutrition equal to that of the captor's own troops. These were not suggestions, they were obligations. American military planners took those obligations seriously. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps was tasked with feeding not only millions of American soldiers overseas, but also hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners at home. This was possible because the United States, unlike Germany, still possessed an intact agricultural base. Farms produced surplus grain, meat, and dairy. Rail networks functioned. Fuel flowed. The war had expanded American production rather than strangled it. As a result, POW meal plans were standardized, and generous by wartime standards, German prisoners were issued 3 meals a day, each hot when possible. Caloric intake met or exceeded minimum nutritional requirements. Protein, carbohydrates, and fats were carefully balanced. Bread was fresh. Coffee was real. Meat was included regularly. This was not charity. It was policy. Camp commanders were instructed that underfeeding prisoners was both illegal and counterproductive. Hungry men became sick, resentful, and dangerous. Well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, healthier, and more compliant, for German POWs arriving from the front lines of a collapsing Reich. The contrast was immediate and disorienting. They had not crossed into comfort. They had crossed into a system that still worked, and that realization would only deepen as captivity continued. The system that fed German prisoners 3 hot meals a day did not emerge spontaneously. It was the product of American wartime planning, legal obligation, and logistical confidence. By 1944, the United States was not merely fighting a global war, it was administering it. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps operated on a scale unseen in history. Millions of uniforms, boots, and rations moved daily across railways and highways that remained largely untouched by enemy attack. Agricultural production expanded rather than collapsed. American farms produced enough surplus food to feed soldiers overseas, civilians at home, and enemy prisoners without significant strain. This abundance shaped policy. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those of American troops stationed in the same theater for prisoners held inside the United States. This meant meals comparable to U.S. Army training camps. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were served at fixed times. Meals were prepared in large field kitchens or permanent mess halls. Depending on the camp, menus were regulated. Typical breakfast included eggs or oatmeal, bread, coffee, and fruit. Lunches featured soups, meat dishes, vegetables, and starches. Dinners were hot, filling, and predictable. While not luxurious, the meals were consistent, and consistency mattered more than variety. For German POWs, this predictability was deeply unsettling. They had been taught that the enemy would punish surrender. Instead, surrender brought routine. Hunger, which had dominated their final months in combat, receded. Weight stabilized. Illness declined. Medical officers noted rapid improvements in physical condition within weeks of arrival. Letters from home sharpened the contrast. Prisoners learned that families in Germany were surviving on turnips, bread substitutes, and ration scraps. Children were undernourished. Elderly parents were weakening. Cities lacked fuel and food alike. The homeland they had fought for was starving. Inside American camps, food never ran out. This created a psychological contradiction that prisoners struggled to reconcile. The enemy they were told to fear appeared capable, confident, and restrained. Feeding POWs generously did not weaken American security. It strengthened it. Well-fed prisoners were calmer. Discipline improved. Violence was rare. American authorities understood this dynamic well. They knew that hunger bred desperation. Desperation bred unrest. 3 meals a day were cheaper than guards, fences, and force. Food was an administrative tool, quiet, effective, and lawful. But for the prisoners, the effect went far beyond administration. Food became a measure of power. If the Americans could feed enemy soldiers better than Germany could feed its own, then something fundamental had shifted. The war was no longer only about weapons or territory. It was about which system could sustain life under pressure. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, German POWs began to understand that the meals they received were not temporary concessions. They were expressions of a system that expected to last. That understanding would shape everything that followed inside the camps. Angle 1. Human angle. From hunger to disbelief for many German prisoners, the first weeks in American captivity felt unreal. Bodies that had grown accustomed to hunger now received steady nourishment. Men who had measured meals by survival suddenly faced full trays 3 times a day. The human response was conflicted. Some prisoners ate quickly, driven by instinct, afraid the food might disappear. Others slowed down, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar feeling of being full. A few struggled physically. Stomachs weakened by months of malnutrition needed time to adjust. Guards noticed the changes first. Weight stabilized. Skin tone improved. Fatigue faded. Medical officers recorded fewer cases of fainting and illness. Men who had arrived thin and withdrawn began talking again. Laughter returned, cautiously at first, yet the emotional impact ran deeper than physical recovery. German POWs compared their meals to memories from the front. In late 1944, many German units survived on less than half the calories now provided in captivity. Civilians at home were eating worse still. The realization was difficult to process. Surrender had improved their physical condition. This produced guilt. Some prisoners felt ashamed eating well while families starved back home. Others felt anger at their own leadership, at the promises they had believed, at the collapse that had made this contrast possible. Food became a daily reminder that something fundamental had broken. The Americans were not starving their enemies. They were sustaining them. And for men trained to equate suffering with honor, that inversion cut deeply. Angle to psychological angle. Routine as a shock weapon. Psychological power of 3 hot meals lay not in abundance, but in repetition. Breakfast arrived every morning. Lunch followed on schedule. Dinner ended the day predictable. There were no sudden reductions. No punishment meals. No uncertainty. For German POWs accustomed to chaos, retreats, shortages, arbitrary orders, this routine was destabilizing. Hunger had been constant in the final months of combat. Food scarcity dominated thought, planning, and morale. In American camps, hunger faded into the background. That silence was unsettling. Without hunger to occupy the mind, other thoughts emerged. Questions surfaced. Prisoners reflected on the war, on leadership, on promises made and broken. Ideology weakened not through confrontation, but through absence of crisis. Routine replaced urgency. The meals sent an unspoken message. The Americans were not improvising. They were not reacting. They were operating from a position of control. Feeding the enemy was not risky, it was normal. Psychologically, this undermined the narrative German soldiers had carried into captivity. If the enemy could afford to feed prisoners generously, then defeat was not accidental. It was systemic. 3 meals a day did what propaganda could not. It removed fear and replaced it with quiet certainty. Angle 3. Moral angle. Strength without revengedo. German prisoners. The moral dimension of their treatment was impossible to ignore. They expected punishment. They expected deprivation. They expected revenge. Instead, They encountered restraint. American camp commanders emphasized discipline, not cruelty. Guards enforced rules but did not interfere with meals. There was no attempt to humiliate prisoners through hunger. Food was served without commentary, without spectacle. This restraint carried moral weight. German POWs recognized that the United States was strong enough to win without cruelty. Feeding prisoners well did not signal weakness, it signaled confidence, a belief that victory was secure enough to allow law to function. Some prisoners tried to rationalize this as propaganda. Others believed it would end abruptly. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern held. The enemy was behaving as if the war's outcome was already decided. That realization forced prisoners to confront a painful truth. Their own system had demanded sacrifice without providing security. Hunger had been framed as virtue because resources were failing. The Americans did not need hunger to motivate obedience. They relied on structure. And structure, and war, proved stronger than vengeance. Angle 4. Logistical angle, abundance versus collapse. Being the 3 hot meals stood a reality. German prisoners could not escape. The American system had not broken. By late 1944, Germany's logistics were in free fall. Rail lines lay in ruin. Fuel shortages paralyzed transport. Agricultural output collapsed under bombing, conscription, and territorial loss. Even elite units at the front received irregular and insufficient rations. The United States faced none of these constraints at home. American farms produced surplus food throughout the war. Railroads functioned. Fuel remained available. The quartermaster corps coordinated deliveries with precision, ensuring camps received steady supplies regardless of weather or season. Food moved from farms to rail depots to camp kitchens. Without interruption, German POWs saw the result every day. Bread was fresh, not ersatz. Meat was real, not substitute. Coffee was brewed, not imagined. This consistency revealed a truth German soldiers had sensed but never fully accepted. The war had become a contest between an economy that could expand under pressure and one that collapsed beneath it. 3 meals a day were not generosity. They were evidence that American production exceeded demand. Feeding prisoners did not weaken the system, it proved its depth. And once prisoners understood this, arguments about temporary hardship or eventual recovery lost meaning. The imbalance was structural. Angle 5. Enemy angle. They eat like generals among German prisoners. Comparisons spread quietly. The food they received in captivity was often better than what they had eaten as soldiers. Some joked bitterly that they now ate like generals. Others said nothing, but the phrase circulated, half in disbelief, half in resignation. These comparisons were not exaggerations. By late 1944, German generals themselves faced shortages. Field headquarters lacked supplies. Rations were cut. Even high-ranking officers endured scarcity. Meanwhile, captured enlisted men in America ate predictably and adequately. This inversion unsettled prisoners deeply. Hierarchy had defined their lives. Rank determined access. Sacrifice flowed downward. Yet in captivity, the enemy erased that distinction. Everyone ate the same. Everyone received enough. Post-war memoirs repeatedly note the shock. Former POWs described realizing that the enemy's strength lay not only in weapons, but in fairness. Food was distributed according to need, not status. For men raised in a system that glorified inequality as discipline, this was disorienting. It suggested that leadership did not require deprivation to function, and that realization cut to the core of what they had believed about authority and power. Angle 6. Strategic angle. Feeding the enemy to control the camp. From the American perspective, 3 hot meals were also a tool of control. Well-fed prisoners were healthier. Healthier prisoners were calmer. Calm prisoners required fewer guards, fewer punishments, and fewer resources spent on discipline. Hunger was a liability, not a weapon. Camp reports reflected this clearly. Incidents declined as nutrition improved. Medical costs dropped. Work details ran smoothly. Prisoners complied with schedules and rules without constant enforcement. Camps became predictable environments rather than volatile holding centers. German POWs noticed this as well. They saw that food was not conditional. It was not withdrawn as punishment. It was constant. That constancy removed leverage from extremists inside the camps and weakened resistance before it formed. Strategically, the approach was effective. The camps remained stable even as the war ended and uncertainty grew. When surrender came, there were no riots, no desperate uprisings. The system held for prisoners. This reinforced the final lesson. The Americans did not need cruelty to maintain order. They relied on structure, law, and nourishment, and that understanding prepared the ground for the final psychological shift still to come. When prisoners accepted that the meals would not end, because the war itself was ending, the turning point arrived quietly without announcement. Weeks passed, then months. The meals did not change. Breakfast remained hot. Lunch arrived on schedule. Dinner closed each day with the same predictability. Portions did not shrink. Menus did not thin. There was no moment when guards warned that supplies were running low. No sudden tightening of belts. No punishment disguised as policy. For German prisoners, this continuity became impossible to ignore. Many had expected the generosity to end once they settled into camp life. They believed the Americans would eventually reveal the truth that 3 meals a day were temporary, designed only to calm new arrivals. But winter came, and the food remained. Spring followed, and the meals were unchanged. The realization spread slowly through the barracks. This was not mercy. This was not deception. This was sustainability. As news filtered in from Europe, the contrast sharpened. Letters from home spoke of empty markets, shrinking rations, and families surviving on substitutes barely recognizable as food. Entire cities were cold and hungry. Children grew thin. Elderly parents weakened. Inside the camps, prisoners ate. The contradiction became unbearable for some. A number of prisoners initially refused full portions, believing it dishonorable to eat well while civilians starved. Others hoarded food out of habit, hiding bread in lockers long after it was necessary. Over time, those behaviors faded. The system proved reliable enough to be trusted. Trust, once formed, changed everything. Men began planning their days around meals rather than scarcity. Conversations shifted. Instead of discussing hunger, they talked about news, the future, and what might come after the war. The constant pressure that hunger exerted on thought disappeared. That absence created space for reflection. Prisoners began comparing what they experienced with what they had been told. The enemy they were warned would starve them instead fed them consistently. The system that demanded sacrifice from German soldiers could not even feed its own people. The contradiction was no longer abstract. It was lived 3 times a day. American camp commanders noticed the change. Asterisk reports noted improved discipline without additional enforcement. Fewer medical emergencies. Reduced tension between prisoners. Camps became quieter, more orderly, more predictable. The greatest threat to controlled desperation had been removed. Then came the moment that sealed the shift. In several camps, prisoners learned that food rations would remain unchanged regardless of developments at the front. The meals were not tied to battlefield success or failure. They were tied to policy. The Americans did not plan to punish prisoners for a war already decided. That realization carried enormous weight. It meant that captivity was no longer contingent on hope or fear. It was structured, finite, and governed by rules that had not failed even as Germany itself was collapsing. The war was still being fought, but inside the wire, the psychological battle had ended. Asterisk. German prisoners understood that the system feeding them would outlast the system they had served. The 3 meals a day were proof not of kindness, but of endurance. And endurance, once demonstrated, could not be argued away. By early 1945, the meaning of the meals had changed completely. They were no longer surprising. They were no longer questioned. They were accepted as fact, and that acceptance marked the true turning point. German prisoners followed the news of the war with growing clarity. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Cities fell in rapid succession. Each update confirmed what many already sensed. The Reich was collapsing. Inside the camps, however, nothing collapsed. The kitchens operated as they always had. Supplies arrived on schedule. Guards followed procedure. Medical care continued. The 3 meals a day remained untouched by the chaos overseas. For prisoners, this contrast was devastating in its simplicity. The system that had demanded absolute loyalty from them could not protect their families from hunger. The system holding them captive could. This realization did not spark rebellion or despair. It produced resignation, calm, sober, and irreversible. Hardline loyalists inside the camps found themselves increasingly isolated. Their warnings about deception no longer held weight. The evidence was too consistent, too routine, too ordinary. Ideology cannot survive repetition without reinforcement, and the meals provided none. Prisoners began speaking openly about the future. What would Germany look like after defeat? How would people survive the coming months? What kind of authority could rebuild what had been destroyed? These conversations would have been unthinkable months earlier. Hunger had dominated thought. Now, nourishment allowed perspective. American camp reports from this period describe a notable shift in behavior. Compliance was nearly universal. Tensions among prisoners declined. Requests for books, newspapers, and educational materials increased. Some camps organized language classes and vocational training. Supported by stable routines and full stomachs, this was not re-education by force. It was disillusionment by exposure. The decisive moment came not with Germany's surrender in May 1945, but in the weeks leading up to it. By then, most prisoners had already accepted the outcome. The end of the war did not shock them. It confirmed what they had been living. When surrender was announced, there were no riots, no desperate reactions. Men listened in silence. Some cried. Others stared ahead, already thinking about home. And still, the meals came. Breakfast the next morning was served as usual. That detail mattered. It signaled continuity beyond the war itself. The system did not need victory to function. It did not collapse with peace. It simply continued. For German prisoners, this was the final lesson. The war had been lost not only because Germany was defeated in battle, but because its system could not sustain life under pressure. The Americans had not merely won. They had endured without asking their soldiers or their prisoners to starve for it. By the time the barbed wire began to come down, the psychological battle was long over. The 3 meals a day had done their work. They had answered every question ideology could no longer explain, and they had prepared the ground for what came next, returning to a country that would need to relearn what strength truly meant. When the war in Europe ended, the camps did not erupt in chaos. There were no mass protests, no hunger riots, no violent reckoning between guards and prisoners. Instead, there was order. The reason was simple. German prisoners were not starving. In the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945, American POW camps continued to function exactly as they had before. Meals were served on schedule. Medical care continued. Discipline remained procedural rather than punitive. The collapse of the Reich did not alter the daily routine inside the wire. For many prisoners, this was when the full meaning of their captivity became clear. They were alive. They were healthy. They were fed. And they were preparing to return to a homeland they knew through letters and reports was devastated. Hungry and broken, American medical officers noted the contrast immediately. German POWs repatriated from U.S. camps were, on average, in better physical condition than many German civilians and even demobilized soldiers inside Europe. Weight had stabilized. Diseases linked to malnutrition were rare. Dental health, muscle strength, and general endurance had improved during captivity. The 3 hot meals a day had not only sustained life, they had preserved capacity. Red Cross inspections confirmed this repeatedly. Reports described camps as clean, orderly, and nutritionally adequate. Inspectors noted that food quality met or exceeded Geneva Convention standards and was often comparable to that of American troops stationed nearby. This had practical consequences. Healthy prisoners were easier to repatriate. They required fewer medical resources upon return. They were physically capable of rebuilding lives, families, and communities. In a Europe shattered by war, that mattered. For the prisoners themselves, the realization was sobering. Many understood that had they remained at the front or returned earlier, they might not have survived the final months of the war. Hunger had claimed thousands of German soldiers and civilians alike. Captivity, paradoxically, had offered protection from collapse. This awareness did not erase guilt or loss. Families had suffered, friends had died, cities lay in ruins. But it reframed defeat. The Americans had not humiliated them, they had not punished them, they had not starved them. They had fed them consistently, lawfully, without spectacle. As preparations for repatriation began, prisoners were processed carefully, records were checked, health evaluations conducted. Men were returned in stages, not cast back into chaos. Even in defeat, the system maintained order. The immediate aftermath of captivity revealed something profound. The war had ended, but the habits of sustainment had not. The same system that fed prisoners during war now ensured they were fit to survive peace. And for many Germans returning home, the memory of those meals would follow them not as comfort, but as contrast, a contrast that would shape how they understood both defeat and recovery. When German prisoners returned home, the contrast became impossible to escape. They stepped into cities reduced to rubble. Rail stations stood shattered. Factories lay silent. Food queues stretched for hours. Rations were thin, uncertain, and often absent. Families survived on substitute stirnups, watery soups, bread made from whatever could be ground and baked. Hunger, which captivity had muted, returned with force, and with it came memory. Former POWs spoke quietly among themselves about the camps in America, not with nostalgia, with astonishment. They compared the predictability of meals to the chaos now surrounding them. 3 hot meals a day, served on time, had been an anchor in a collapsing world. Back home, nothing was certain. These memories carried weight. They shaped how former soldiers interpreted defeat. Many concluded that Germany had not lost solely because of battlefield failures or superior enemy weapons. It had lost because its system could not sustain life under prolonged pressure. Food shortages had crippled morale, health, and judgment long before surrender. American captivity became, in retrospect, a lesson in governance. Former POWs noticed how rules had been applied consistently, how food distribution had been standardized, how law had continued to function even in wartime. These observations filtered into post-war conversations, workplaces, and communities as Germany struggled to rebuild. Historians later found this pattern repeated in memoirs and interviews. Again and again, former prisoners returned to the same detail. They had eaten better in captivity than at home. Not because Americans were generous, but because Americans were organized. This realization did not excuse the war. It did not erase responsibility, but it reframed the path forward. Reconstruction required stability. Stability required systems. Systems require the ability to feed people reliably. For some former POWs, the experience influenced their lives directly. A number emigrated to the United States in the years that followed, drawn by memories of order, and opportunity. Others carried the lesson into post-war German institutions, supporting reforms that emphasized welfare, planning, and economic security. The 3 meals a day were never intended to teach ideology. They taught something more practical. They demonstrated that power did not require cruelty, that authority did not need hunger to enforce obedience, that confidence could afford restraint. In the long aftermath of the war, these lessons mattered. They shaped how a defeated nation understood recovery not through sacrifice alone, but through sustainment. The memory of eating like generals in captivity became, paradoxically, a benchmark for what a functioning society looked like, and that memory lingered, quietly influencing how Germany rebuilt itself from the ruins. Wars are often remembered through violence, through battles won and lost, through cities destroyed, through the final moment when one side collapses and the other stands victorious. But beneath those moments lies a quieter truth that determines how long a nation can fight at all. It must be able to feed people. For German prisoners held in the United States, 3 hot meals a day were not acts of kindness. They were evidence. Evidence that the enemy possessed something deeper than military strength. A system that functioned without desperation. A structure that did not rely on hunger to enforce control. The shock was never about luxury. It was about reliability. Breakfast arrived every morning. Lunch followed without exception. Dinner closed the day. Predictably, that repetition carried meaning. It told prisoners that the war had not strained American capacity beyond its limits. It revealed that defeat had not come from chance or betrayal, but from imbalance between a nation that could expand under pressure and one that collapsed beneath it. Germany had asked its soldiers to endure hunger as proof of loyalty. America had removed hunger as a variable entirely. In that difference, the outcome of the war was already written. The United States did not need to break its enemies through cruelty. It could afford restraint. Feeding prisoners did not weaken American authority, it confirmed it. Law continued to operate because the system behind it was strong enough to sustain life. Even in wartime, for the men behind the wire, this realization lingered long after repatriation. It followed them into ruined cities and empty kitchens. It shaped how they understood defeat, responsibility, and recovery. The war ended with surrender documents and silence, but its lessons endured in memory. Power is not proven by how much suffering a nation can demand. It is proven by how much stability it can preserve. In the end, the 3 meals a day served in American POW camps did not change the course of the war. The war had already been decided, but they revealed why. Because victory belongs not to the system that consumes its people fastest, but to the one that can keep them alive, disciplined, and fed until the fighting is over. And in that quiet truth, the real story of the war comes into focus.